Ryan is a professor of creative writing at University of Limerick. He has published 6 novels and 1 collection of short stories, all bestsellers. He has been listed not once but twice for the Man Booker Prize. He has won a slew of awards and has been described as one of Ireland's best-loved contemporary writers. He is the only Irish person ever to win the highly prestigious Prix Jean Monnet for European literature, and I think that was last year. And he has also been described by Sebastian Barry as the king of the new wave of Irish writers. Do you ever sleep, Donal?
Actually, teacher says that.
And anyway, Donal's going to read first for a while, and then we're going to have a chat.
Thank you, Sarah, for a lovely introduction. So I'm going to read, it's actually opposite that this is the Cork Short Story Festival, because my new novel, The Queen of Dirt Island, is kind of composed of a series of vignettes, and they're all kind of self-contained. So they do read like flash fiction, and they're all exactly 500 words. And it really upsets people. Well, some people, most people think it's great. Except for Chris from New York Times. Anyway, I don't know what Olympian even means. Olympian. So this is, I'm going to read just a series of 3 or 4 vignettes in a row, and there's no real spoilers here, but at this point in the novel, the second main character, whose name is Eileen Elbert, is proposed to by her deceased husband's brother. And this is witnessed by her daughter, Saoirse, who is 11, I think, at this stage. And this vignette is called Proposal. Chris proposed to Mother on an evening in early summer with his working clothes on him, as though he'd been seized suddenly by some amorous impulse, some wild desire that had been lying dormant. He came rushing down from the fields to the village, half-cocked, as Nenagh said later, though she didn't wholly disapprove of his hastily conceived and poorly executed plan. He stood a long while at the side door, mumbling. Saoirse had never seen a redder face. Mother had stepped back to let him in. She had a cigarette just lit, and she was pulling on it deeply. "Come in, Chris," she said through a cloud of blue smoke. "I won't, Eileen. My boots are covered in muck. I won't drag it in along your clean floor." "I'll clean my arse," said Mother. And Chris laughed, a high chuckle, the way he always did. Chris enjoyed Mother, and she liked him right back. From somewhere, from the ether or the blue heavens, or the fumes of new growth or agricultural diesel, he drew courage, and he made his proposal. "Eileen, I was wondering," Saoirse heard him say. "Wondering what, Chris?" "I was wondering if it wouldn't be the best thing for all concerned, if you and me, if I and you, if you and I, if me and you," and then he said it straight, nearly in a shout, "Will you marry me?" Saoirse saw Mother bend forward as though someone had struck her in the stomach, and she grabbed in her 2 fists the lapels of Chris's overalls and pulled him into the kitchen. Slamming the door closed in the same movement, Chris's eyes were opened wide in shock. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't to be manhandled off his feet. He straightened himself and put a hand over his face and drew it downwards, as if to reset himself, to regain something of his passive countenance. "What kind of rubbish are you talking, Chris?" But Chris didn't know, it seemed, what kind of rubbish he'd been talking. But on he ploughed. "We wouldn't have to, you know yourself, be married in the fullness of the word. We just, you know yourself, take the bad look off of things. You'd have, you know yourself, a bit of company. Yourself and the baby." "Baby?" Saoirse was 11 years old, and she opened her mouth to protest this slight, but some vague wisdom rose from within her and silenced her. Paddy and Chris called her the baby, and maybe they always would. "I love you dearly, Chris," said Mother, "and I'd be a lucky, lucky woman if I were free to marry you. But I'm still, in my heart and soul, married to your brother, and I will be, I'd say, for all of eternity." Chris said it was okay. He was sorry. And Mother said she was sorry too, and she kissed his cheek. And Chris dragged himself back up the hillside and didn't come down again for a long time. The next vignette is called Handlebars. That's a bad title, actually. I'm sorry I called it Handlebars. Anyway. "Heavy the blooms, Eileen." Wasn't that the first line of the song? Mother didn't know, but Nenagh went away singing it anyway, making up her own words. On her way to the main road, she passed a boy on a bicycle. No hands on the handlebars, so that's why. A hurley tucked under his oxter. You will break your neck, young Gleeson, doing that. But the boy just laughed and said, Hello, Mrs. Aylbert, and cycled on, shifting his way to the left to turn into the estate, and to the right to turn in the short driveway, where Saoirse and Mother stood. The way he steered the bicycle with no hands looked like something as magical as the trapeze people at the circus in Nenagh might have done. Something impossible, right in front of you. Hello, Eileen. Hello, Saoirse. She wondered how he knew her name. He was wearing shorts and a hurling jersey in the parish colours. He had red cheeks and blue eyes, and his arms and legs were the longest arms and legs Saoirse had ever seen, longer even than Paddy's or Chris's, and there were green grass stains in his legs and his shorts. He ought to cycle away home now and have a bat for himself, Saoirse thought, and her thoughts were in Nana's voice, as they often were. It was funny to think of what Nana might say in any given situation, to think in Nana's voice. Mother was looking at the boy on the bicycle in a cross way, and when she spoke to him, her voice was whispery, and she looked sideways at Saoirse before and after she spoke. Go on now, Jamie. Go home and clean the grass off of yourself. That struck Saoirse as fantastically funny. Her mother had said the thing that she knew Nana would say, or a version of it, and she laughed out loud. Will you come to my 21st, Eileen, please? The boy said. Or maybe he was a man. There was some hair above his lips, and white shiny hairs on his arms and legs, but he hadn't the grisly rough look of older men with skin like pork chops. I will not, Mother said back, in her sharp, that's all there is to it voice. I'd look well. You would, Eileen. You always look well. And Mother turned towards Saoirse and said, Lovey, will you please go into my bedroom and get my handbag off the bed, good girl? But Saoirse stood just inside the door, and she could hear Mother saying, You know you can't just arrive here like this. The neighbours will be fattening at the sight of you. And the buyman was saying, Eileen, please. And Saoirse, on a sudden impulse, blocked her ears. And when she looked out again, the boy was cycling down the avenue towards the lake road, his hands on the handlebars now. And Mother was standing in a patch of white sun, looking up at the white sky. Oh, it's the sky. Look at the sky. Had to ruin it. This vignette is called Stories. Have you any news? Stories were everywhere. You could listen, or you could choose not to, but the stories would find their way to all ears eventually. And you could believe them, or you could choose not to. Stories came in from Nenagh, and down from Portroe, and up from the lake, and down from the mountains. Nana called in on her way home from devotions many a Sunday evening, bursting with news. Saoirse had never been to devotions because Mother said it was just extra mass, and once a week was more than enough for anyone. One Sunday evening in particular, Nana came in, full to bursting, a smell from her of incense and sweat, a fevered aura about her. Before she even had her gloves or hat taken off, before she laid her missal down, from just inside the door, she started to speak, and her voice was shrill with excitement. Mother seemed to sense that Nana's news was unfit for Saoirse's 12-year-old ears because she told her to go on outside. And Nana stopped and pursed her lips, but she was moving up and down like she needed to pee. And Saoirse lingered near the slightly open sash at the living room window to see how much of Nana's story she could catch. But she couldn't make out the names, just the fact that the story was about a pair of dykes. Saoirse didn't know what that word meant, but Mother's voice sounded cross when she repeated it. Dykes! Where did you hear that disgusting word? Nana said she'd heard it plenty of times. You'd be surprised, lady, at the words I hear. Anyway, it's true. They were seen holding hands and canoodling down the Callas several times by several reliable witnesses. What do you think about that? I don't want to think about it, Mary, Mother replied. They're fine women, and what they do together is their private business. Private business! They have a right to keep it private, so, besides broadcasting it to all the living and the dead. Fine women, how are you? What do they even do to one another? I don't know. Doesn't bear thinking about. Mother shouted then, suddenly, so loud that Saoirse felt her eardrums vibrating. Don't fucking think about it then! Just shut up! Shut up, will you? Mother and Nana were silent for a good while, on into the darkness. Mother going about her tasks with a censorious air, a simmering brusqueness, and finally Nana rose to go. She'd been waiting stubbornly for a softening, for an apologetic approach, for an opportunity to regain Mother's good graces. I'll be off then, she said from the door, and she knotted her headscarf tight below her chin. A full minute passed, or maybe more, and Mother said, oh, fuck it anyway. and she hurried into the moonlight to make up with her mother-in-law, her dearest friend, to see her across the main road as far as the end of the Boreen.
So obviously there at the start, introducing you, I referenced all the different, many plaudits in your career. But I'd like to take you back to the start of your career and ask you about when you were first looking for a book deal. How easy or hard was that?
Well, actually, it sounds like it was hard because it was kind of made a big deal of in the press when my first book was nominated for the Booker Prize, because it was a big story that this novel had been multiply rejected. But I genuinely thought that this must be the case for every person who's trying to get published, because it was kind of the image I had of a person trying to, any book I'd ever read where there was a writer in the book who was trying to get a book published. They always had to send the book off to publishers in an envelope, a manuscript, and you get a letter back saying no, and then eventually you get a letter saying yes. So I thought this was going to happen, But my wife and Marie made me stay sending out manuscripts, and I spend a lot now on postage because it's expensive. And actually, once I got an email, I sent an email to an agent, and she emailed back saying, "Will you send me the whole novel in hard copy?" So I went off. It was at a really cold winter, about 2009, I think it was, and it was about -15. And I was wearing shorts and runners and a hoodie, and I ran out of the house for manuscript. And I had no printer at home, so I ran down to Polyprint down the road, and I fell on the way down. In front of school kids, and I fell and I slid, so I was on the ground sliding down a hill. And these kids just looking at me like this, I was sliding along. So I got to Polyprint, and my leg was all busted up in blood and gravel and ice and shit, and I was really crying at the pain of it. And I gave the girl at Polyprint my USB stick, and I said, "There's this file there called Spinning Heart, will you print it off for me, please?" And for some reason, what came up on her screen was an email my friend Gary sent to me about a year beforehand, taken on a beach on his honeymoon. And I just looked like a pervert, to be honest. So I said, "I'm so sorry, I don't know where it came from. Can you please just, the file called Spinning Heart." And at this stage, with tears in my face and everything, And so eventually she printed off the manuscript for me. It took about an hour, and I went to the post office, just got the last post, and sent it off, and I never heard from the agent again. But I said, "I hope I'm not one of those agents that didn't reply to you." So it was. But other than that, no, that was the only hard part really, because literally all it was me sending out emails and manuscripts to publishers, and eventually I got a letter back from Bridport Press saying they'd like to see all my work and me.
So you basically suffered for your art that day, physically?
Yeah, that was definitely, I literally suffered for my art for that moment of sliding along the hill and then being embarrassed by my friend's email in the Polyprint shop.
I think your latest book, which is brilliant by the way, The Queen of Dirt Island, did I read that you wrote that in 12 weeks?
Yep.
And how in God's name did you achieve that?
Actually, I think it was less, but Anne-Marie insisted it was 12 weeks, and I kept saying it was 7 weeks. She said, no, definitely, we're fecking about up there for about 5 weeks. Playing guitar and stuff.
It's kind of depressing to hear by the way for some writers, go on.
Well, Sarah, I heard Kevin Power say recently that he reckons every writer has one 12-week book in them. And Mary Costello said the same thing. I think when she was writing her second novel, The River Capture, I think she said that it took her a really short time, or maybe it was Academy Street, but anyway, she said it just all fell into place, and I had that feeling, that experience, normally there's some struggle, but with this novel, there was none at all. It felt genuinely like a gift from the universe. It felt like my grandmothers got together and said, "Poor fucker, he's in awful trouble," because I'd written a much longer novel that I thought was my opus. I thought it was a work of genius, and my publisher said, "No, it's not really at all." And it turned out it wasn't publishable unless it was radically overhauled, taken apart piece by piece and put back together in a new form, and I just hadn't the heart for it. So I kind of prayed, I was kind of praying for an idea, for inspiration. I was thinking, if I could just manage to do the Kevin Power thing and write a 12-week novel, geez, that'd be great. And in that moment, literally, the idea for the whole novel came almost fully formed to my brain, like it was painted there by somebody. Just felt like a gift, and there was no effort. I don't remember one moment of sitting down thinking, I've got a problem here, it's narrative, or I never came on a sticky moment. There was never a moment I was sitting there thinking I can't move forward, It was just so easy. It was great.
And not to be negative nor now, because that all sounds great, and obviously festivals are always populated by lots of writers typically, so I'm sure there's lots of published and unpublished writers thinking, God, I hope that happens to me. What did you do with the novel that took 2 years? Are you planning on doing anything with it, or?
Well, I have a nephew, he's very clever, and he told me there's these things called non-fungible tokens. So apparently he can, or some friend of his, can make a novel into a non-fungible token that can be sold as a single entity for big money, apparently. So I reckon I can retire from this novel.
So a lot of writers, when they're asked my next question, they have very different responses to it. Like Wyan Lee, who's written a lot of short stories, who I absolutely adore, she says that an author's life bleeds onto the page. Then conversely, I've heard a lot of authors almost take umbrage if they were asked this question, and they say, what are you saying? I don't just open my diary and write it down. But is your work autobiographical in the main, or often, or?
You know, a lot of it is really. I set nearly all of my stories and novels in the same tiny geographical area between the Silver Mines Mountains and the Yarra Mountains. So they're all in this fictional village that's kind of a composite of my home village and the town of Nenagh and the village of Newport. So it's all very familiar. And but I do tend to have to look very far beyond my own experience for my characters' experiences. But I think it just, for me, it's very handy and it's very easy to have the lexicon and landscape of my native place as raw material. But I do tend to turn up sometimes myself on the page, and I really am not narcissistic or self-important in any way.
We'll be the judge.
No, so I know. I suppose even saying it like you probably think, yeah, he obviously is saying it like. But I really like sometimes I just think most of the time I think I'm just a fucking idiot. You know, and I shouldn't speak in public. I shouldn't leave the house really. You know, I should just write the attic and give it to Anne-Marie to start out. And I should really. You know, that'd be great. But sometimes I walk into my own stories like Josh Elmwood is me basically, and nearly everybody hates him. It's terrible.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
God, really?
I know, yeah. And people go, "Oh, that character Josh is such shit," and I've always taken it personally because, yeah, the way Josh thinks and the way he sees the world and his kind of, he's, you know, just the way he is really is. I remember being that way myself at his age, basically.
Well, so to ask you kind of a follow-on question from that, let's just assume on the basis of your answer there that your work is definitely informed by, you know, not just your direct experience, but by people that you've met within your locality, is the sense I'm getting, or people that you know. Have you ever had anybody challenge you and say, you know, who's been unhappy with the way that they felt they were rendered on the page and they were unhappy?
Absolutely, yeah. I met a couple at a funeral actually in West Limerick a few years ago. I had my hand out, shook hands with them, and went my nose up into the air. What the fuck's wrong with them? But it turns out that they were strongly of the belief that they were both in Spinning Heart. And now I wrote Spinning Heart before I ever met either of them or knew they existed. But it just happens that two of the characters have the same names as them. And so it went around West Limerick that I had put these two people in my book, and then worse, that my wife had written the book, but she was too scared to put her name to it, so she got me to put my name to it. But it happens, it does happen, and actually, I know that's kind of a funny story, but I mean, they were genuinely upset about it, but I think they know now that it's not true. But there is a part of the Spinning Heart where a character called Shawnee Shepherd is sitting down contemplating suicide, and I regret writing it the way I wrote it, because he says things about people who committed that deed in that place, and afterwards someone said to me, you know, there are families who were really upset about that, and I so regret that, because, you know, it was so close to home, but it was close to my home as well, you know, but I should have thought longer, you know, but to be honest, my only defence is that, like Chris with the proposal, I went off half-cocked with Spinning Heart, and literally, you know, I thought to myself, there's no risk here to anybody, to me or anybody else, because this novel will never ever be published. You know, I'll read it and reread it, and maybe my mum and dad let it be it. Because at the time, you know, the rejections for my first novel, I think about December, were just pouring in the door. And I wrote Spinning Heart because I wanted to write a series of monologues in a dramatic voice to see if I could do it. And I thought, you know, it's not even a novel. You know, it doesn't have a 3-act structure. It's just monologues. And so, you know, and I thought, there's no need to censor myself, there's no need to edit as I go, and just let it all out.
Now, just to kind of lighten it up a bit, there's an awful lot of humour in your, is this microphone working, by the way?
Right down close to it like this.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of humour in your books, which I personally love. One thing that I've noticed with a lot of the younger writers, some of them very fated, much garlanded and fated, is that their work is strikingly devoid of humour. Jonathan Franzen, who wrote The Corrections, and I love that book, he's of the belief that an essential quality of fiction is humour. And just before I ask you the question, I just want to read one little paragraph from one of your short stories called Aisling. Now, there's so much humour in your work, but I absolutely love this, as in when I was reading it, I laughed out loud.
It's my second favourite story.
Is it your second favourite? It's one of mine as well, which I picked it. So this is a guy who is, he's into this girl called Aisling, and I think he's been dumped by her basically, but he's looking at her cousin who works in a gym. I seen her cousin a small while ago, all right, mooching around in reception. A big fat yoke she was one time, and she fallen away to nothing. I got a right hop when I recognised her. She's not looking too bad all the same, tightened up the finest, nothing flapping that I could see anyway. Some of them ones that go right skinny after being mud fat for years do have a fierce, sad and sorry look about them. Lonesome after the grub, I suppose. And bits hanging that used to bounce lovely, all the life gone from them. So, I love that. I love that bit. But anyway, so to go back to what Jonathan Franzen said about humour being an essential characteristic of fiction, Donal Ryan, what do you think of that?
I agree completely. I do, yeah. You know, I think, you see, because it's fundamental to life. I mean, it lubricates all social interactions. You know, even the corniest, cheesiest, and mildest of humour is just such a blessing. You know, it really is, and it's something that we need desperately in our lives. I mean, on my darkest days, I've laughed. You know, I think everyone here will recognise that fact. I think, you know. I think we're good at that in Ireland. Flynn O'Brien said we all as Irish had a laugh at the condemned man, and we kind of do, because we had to laugh at a lot of things. But I think it's always there. You know, I mean, we're always. I think nearly everybody, unless you're in an awful stinker of a mood, is always kind of on the edge of a laugh, aren't they? You know, and I think sometimes I laugh myself out of panic. You know, and and I laugh when I'm upset, and you know, and I try my best to act the fool, to cheer people up sometimes, and we just use it in so many different ways. It's so fundamental to how we connect and express ourselves and listen to each other, that I think it's, to not have it in fiction, it's just awful. I remember reading Lesson Zero by Bret Easton Ellis. Now, it's a novel, I think it's fantastic, a really fine novel, but Jesus, it's just, I mean, there are numerous reasons why it's humorless and dry and nothing funny happens, even though the characters in it are wild and they're young and they're taking drugs and doing all sorts. But no one says anything funny really, and it's just a real drag, and it creates such an overbearingly gloomy tone.
Well, I think some of them, we're not going to name the names because that's not necessary,
no.
But some of the younger writers are, I think, devoid of humour. That would be one critique I'd have of them. Now, I just want to ask you another question, right? But before I do, I want to, so before I ask you the question, I want to read out something that Donal, this also made me laugh a lot, right? So, this interviewer in the past had asked Donal, broadly speaking, about how he deals with criticism. Right, here we go. Sorry, I couldn't find it there. So he was answering the question about how he dealt with criticism. I read every review, absolutely everything. I set up Google alerts, so if anybody mentions me, I get an alert. I'd just be lying if I said I didn't. I get really mad if I see a bad review, and I want to go and review that person's whole life. Is that your house? Crap house, 1 star. Is that your wife? She's very ugly, 0 stars. These are scenes in my head. So Donal Ryan, how do you deal with criticism generally?
Genuinely, I imagine myself. No, I could never, ever harm another human. I can't even insult another human, but I imagine myself beating the crap out of them. Unless, you know, if it's a, you know, a youngish male critic, and it always is, to be honest. You know, the guys who will do the ad hominem reviews, and the guys who you know are just seething because they know you're a good writer, and they can't do what you do, and so they write reviews for the Guardian and the Irish Times, and sometimes slagging you off. They're always the same. They're always about my age. They're always Irish guys, and they're always pissed off, you know. And you know, so I can safely imagine myself kicking them around the place, you know. I'd never ever do it, obviously, but just thinking about it is just such a relief, seriously.
Well, you're very honest. It's great to get an answer like that, because too often you hear people saying they turn the other cheek and it's part of the exactly. Okay, so next question. I'd like to mention one of your short stories here, Retirement Do. And the thing about this story that struck me is that the protagonist in the story is a thief, a murderer, a rapist, a paedophile. You know, broadly speaking, he's all of those things. And it's quite a shocking story, and it's very bleak, obviously. But when you're reading it, what's fascinating about it is, as you progress through the story, it's not per se that you have empathy for that protagonist, but you do find yourself as a reader wondering what brought him to that point, right? That's very strong, and it's a very successful thing in the story, and it's an exceptionally hard thing to do. But when I look at your stories as a totality and your work, I really do feel that there's a very strong sense of social justice from all of your work, if that's the right way to put it. Where does that come from?
Well, the serial killer, I don't know.
I'm not saying you're sympathetic to serial killers. My question's a little bit more refined than that.
I genuinely, when people are upset by that story, I absolutely understand. I really do. And I think I had some kind of noble motivation, or what I thought was noble motivation, of trying to reveal something about how someone like that might think, and how it was. I think it was because of I had Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil in my head, and all these things about how the most evil people in the world will think ordinary thoughts. They'll have certain impulses that seem very human, and for the most part will look and act and speak and sound very human, even in their interiorities, and even when they consider what they've done. But that story, I think, is an outlier, to be honest, because it was the first short story I ever finished and was happy with, between the age of 10 and about 28. And the very first story I ever finished, I was 10, and it was about Barry McGuigan having a rematch against Steve Cruz, to whom he lost his lightweight title in '86. And I just loved that story so much, because it just made me realise how powerful words were, and how you could make stuff up that never happened and make it seem as though it happened, and feel relief because now it's kind of happened because you've written it down. It was just unbelievable. And it was nearly 20 years before I had the same success, and it was with that awful story which
well, I suppose what I'm taking from what you're saying, that story, it is quite extreme. But I suppose if you look at your collection of short stories as a totality and look at your work, I always feel that a lot of characters pop up again and again, and often it's fair to say that some of those characters, getting away from that quite extreme example perhaps, have been sort of broken or mistreated by life, or misunderstood, let's say, and they're on the margins. That's true of a lot of your work, isn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think it started from a very ordinary place, just because when I started to write kind of fluently for the first time, kind of in my late 20s, the characters I wrote were all people known to me and loved by me for the most part. And so they were my friends from school, and my friends from where I grew up, and there were guys who worked with me in meat factories in Nenagh and on building sites, and so they were, for the most part, working class, or guys with trades and guys who work in factories, and ordinary people, very ordinary. And I was really surprised actually when my books started to be reviewed, and some reviewers started to refer to the characters as lowlives and people on the edge, and I was, what are you talking about? Like, these are my friends, this is my family. These are the ordinary people who live in ordinary houses in ordinary towns in the States all around the country. But I suppose a lot of people who were in that position were, living kind of rarefied lives and not realising it, and they would see somebody who worked in a building site as a labourer and went drinking every weekend and put soccer matches as a bit of a nothing, a bit of a I don't know, rough ticket or whatever. But for me, it's just like, one of my buddies. So, I mean, there was no real reach for me when it came to writing with people. And then the element of unfairness was just prevalent. When I first started to write Spinning Heart, I was writing, that was, I suppose, very autobiographical, because I was in pretty much the exact same position that Bobby was in, because, we found ourselves suddenly as a family not earning enough in a month to cover everything we needed to cover in a month, and like everybody was in the same boat. And so that situation was very real to me, and the things that Bobby was feeling and that his friends were feeling, I was feeling myself at the time. And I kind of knew, and I had a kind of vague idea that if I could manage to write a novel that confronted Ireland's contemporary situation at the time, I could fill an empty niche in the market and I could make about 20 grand. And that's what happened. It was great. My first advance was 20 grand. Paid off credit card, paid off the overdraft.
Whoa there, I wanted to ask you a question about that. What because I read something really funny recently that Ardlo Hanlon said about this advance he got. Basically, he got the advance and then he couldn't come up with the work, something, broadly speaking, and he spent it on a kitchen extension. So, what did you do with your first advance?
I paid off my credit card and my overdraft and whatever bits I had to pay off, and I had a little cushion of a couple of grand for the first time in my whole life. It was just amazing.
So, just to talk about the book for a little bit, Joan Slater's book is The Queen of Dirt Island, and it's absolutely fabulous. Just one thing that's in the book a lot, sort of sex and shame feature a lot in Queen of Dirt Island. So you have the girl who waited out by the bridge for truck drivers, you've Saoirse and Brady cadging lips in town like tramps, that's what someone called them. Eileen being described as a whore by her brother, Saoirse also being called a whore or slut. It's tipexed on the wall at school that Brady rides her dad, that's a quote. And it kind of struck me that in this book, which is set, there's four female protagonists, so it's set over the 80s, the 90s, into the 2000s, so it's set over kind of sort of 3 to 4 generations. There's kind of a savage innocence and a savage ignorance about sex generally in the book. Do you think that's reflective of Irish life?
That's very interesting, Sarah. I didn't see that myself now, to be honest. But not to mention that, I suppose there is, all right, yeah. But you see, I'm always fascinated by the way teenagers talk about each other, and the way we speak as teenagers, and how completely unfettered and uncivilized and wild we are, and how we put on a really innocent, quiet face to adults, but between ourselves as teenagers, there just are no limits to our depravities. And I wanted to reflect something of that in a way, and I also wanted to reflect the kind of the hypocritical morality that it wasn't just Ireland. I think we kind of think that this just happened in Ireland in the 80s and 70s, up until the 80s and early 90s. The whole world, pretty much, if you were a teenage girl and unmarried and got pregnant, there would be people who call you a slut and look down on you and call you other names, while, their own behaviour, if you look back at their lives, wouldn't have been on any kind of moral level, so-called, you know what I mean? Like, it's always hypocritical when someone does that, when someone judges. And so I wanted to get that, but I kind of wanted to get it out in one go, so just one vignette where Saoirse's mum just screams at her, and it's one sentence, and just one sentence of absolute profanity. And actually, that sentence was almost verbatim the sentence that my mum screamed at my sister she was in the same boat. So I just wrote it down as I remember it, and I love that. I love that chapter. But what I love about it most is that she's so angry. She's so incensed, she's calling her every name under the sun. There's no name she won't call her in that moment. But then a few days later, she's going, fuck it now, what can we do?
Yeah.
Which is the best reaction possible in that situation,
Now I have a couple more questions I want to ask you. We're kind of yapping on, so do you want to read your Dole's going to read us, we're very lucky, a new short story that hasn't been published. Do you want to read that?
So it's called, I think it's pronounced Acheloos, the river in Greece. It's called Acheloos. The Acheloos River, is it? But Acheloos, anyway, is a river god. It's very short. I'm up on 80 now, by all accounts. So it must be 20 odd years since I did a bit of building work for a man in Nenagh called Desi Tracy. Desi was some man to tell a story. I often used to tip into town on a Saturday afternoon, and before I went near the pub or the bookies, I'd call in to Desi's workshop, where he had plant for hire, and I'd sit in behind the counter with him and his young sons, and he'd tell story after story. Some men will corner you and try their damnedest to tell you every single thing that ever happened to them in their life, and you'd sooner cut off your own ears with a rusty blade and listen to them. But men like Desi are like a kind of a channel, a conduit, for all the wit and fascination beneath the firmament, and listening to them is like being weightless, painless, invisible almost. You needn't do a thing but sit still and be transported. This is a true story, by the way. Desi told me one Saturday morning about something that happened to him one time when he was out in Lough Derg fishing for pike. He was having a good day, drawing them from the water nearly at will. Desi had a way of reading the mood of the water, of judging the flow and ripple of it, the spread and density of the clouds of insects along the foreshore, the smell of the lifting outshore breeze, the skim of mist along the surface of the water in the rising bay, that allowed him to position himself in a spot where he'd be able to whisper the fish into his boat, with hardly a need for a rod. He could sense through the wood of the floor of his boat the motion of the shoals, feel on his hands and face the dipping and the rising of his prey. Anyway, on this particular day, Desi had a boat nearly capsizing with pike, long, razor-toothed devils of things, fish that could bite a man's arm off. A pike will eat anything, and therefore is not considered good eating, but Desi had the knack of filleting and salting and buttering them into wondrousness, and he had an empty chest freezer he intended to stock for the winter from the bounty of the lake. Just as he was thinking of heading ashore, his line tautened, and he drew and reeled, but it wouldn't come, only strained his rod nearly to breaking, and pulled him along against his locked oars, and he knew he had a big one, a king, an apex hunter trapped by another, and he was in a battle, suddenly. So he planted his feet wide and braced his shoulders for the struggle. A shadow fell across his boat then, and he wouldn't even have looked up if it weren't for the smell that rose with the falling light, an alien odour, yet strangely familiar, of ferment and mineral and the foul sweetness of decay. And he set his rod and turned around, and filling the sky behind him was a long-necked, wide-snouted thing, rising up and up from the dark water, green-black and scaled and yellow-eyed, and in the centre of the yellow were two black slits, and the apparition opened its great jaw, and Desi was looking into the deepest depths of his own nightmares, into the fanged and fork-tongued maw of death. He knew in that moment that the monster was warning him that he'd taken too much from the water, that the creature straining at his line was to be released. He turned away from the beast and back to his line, and he took his knife and cut it, and the sun shone again on his skin, and the warmth of the day returned, but the smell of death remained. And when a pike, maybe 5 feet in length, broke the water an oar's length from his side, he screamed so loud he was hoarse for days. The pike broke again, nearer him, and lifted itself up from the water, so that it was leaning into the timber of his stern, almost flat onto his quarter knee. And Desi could see that his line was trailing from the pike's great mouth, and inside it was a lure he'd fashioned from a copper spoon to the shape of a baby trout. And the hook attached to it was fast inside its flesh. It rolled its eyes balefully at him, and Desi, without thinking, leaned across and reached into the pike's open mouth. He dislodged his hook and his copper lure, and the sun flashed white in the pike's dark eye before he flopped back into the bottomless water of the centre of the lake. I never met the monster myself, but then again, I was never much of a fisherman. I dreamt of it though, and I watched always when I rowed out from the headlands into the open water for its shadow, and tested the breeze for its smell, and once or twice, or maybe a handful of times, I sensed its presence near me, watching, and I knew it possessed the sum of all knowledge of me and of all men, of the doings and undoing of the world. You might read a poem by Sarah Harte. I just like to always read this poem when I read in public, because this poem means an awful lot to me and to a lot of people. Because this poem is full of hope about the world and humanity and how we should be, and how most of us actually are. It's called Summer Solstice, New York City, and after I was bereaved by suicide, this poem meant an awful lot to me. Summer Solstice, New York City, by Sharon Olds. By the end of the longest day of the year, he could not stand it. He went up the iron stairs, through the roof of the building, and over the soft, tarry surface to the edge, put one leg over the complex green tin cornice, and said, if they came a step closer, that was it. Then the huge machinery of the earth began to work for his life. The cops came in their suits, blue-grey as the sky on a cloudy evening, and one put on a bulletproof vest, a dense shell around his own life of his children's father, in case the man was armed. And one, slung with a rope like the sign of his bounden duty, came up out of a hole in the top of the neighbouring building, like the hole they say is in the top of the head, and began to lurk toward the man who wanted to die. The tallest cop approached him directly, softly, slowly, talking to him, talking, while the man's leg hung over the lip of the next world, and the crowd gathered in the street silent, and the hairy net with its implacable grid was unfolded near the curb and spread out and stretched as the sheet was prepared to receive at a birth. Then they all came a little closer, where he squatted next to his death, his shirt glowing its milky glow like something growing in a dish at night in the dark in a lab, and then everything stopped as his body jerked, and he stepped down from the parapet and went toward them, and they closed on him. I thought they were going to beat him up, as a mother whose child has been lost might scream at the child when it's found. They took him by the arms and held him up and leaned him against the wall of the chimney, and the tall cop lit a cigarette in his own mouth and gave it to him, and then they all lit cigarettes, and the red glowing ends burned like the tiny campfires we lit at night back at the beginning of the world.
Speaking of suicide there, just without giving any spoilers or anything, let's just say it's a theme in your new book, Queen of Dirt Island. Just wanted to ask you, because I know you teach at third level in the University of Limerick. I read recently enough that in Britain there are now trigger warnings on some Agatha Christie novels. This is for third level students. And I just wondered, you know, given that you are a writer and that you teach in university, what do you think of that notion? Like hypothetically, with your new book, do you think there should be a trigger warning on that?
That's a great question, Sarah. I didn't realise that about those trigger warnings in England, but you know, in one way, like, what harm can they do? And you know, I didn't believe that. I came across this recently. I said something at an event, and somebody got really upset, really suddenly, and really visibly and audibly upset. And I thought what I had said was fairly benign and innocuous, and it turned out what I'd said really upset her. And I was thinking, there's no way to legislate for this. There's no way I could have known that that was going to trigger that lady. So, you know, I was thinking, I wonder should I preface every single speech I make or every event or every class I give with a list of things I'm going to talk about. But that would really be stymieing to the kind of the freedom we need to discuss creativity, I think. And I mean, it's going to be limiting, I think, in all sorts of ways. But on the other hand, I genuinely do hate the thought of upsetting anyone. I really do. I absolutely, it just breaks my heart if someone says, "Oh, Donal, I read a bit in your book and it really upset me." Now, I don't mind being sad because my book's sometimes very sad. When something really affects them or upsets them, or if to them it seems I've been crass or heavy-handed, or you know, that I've gone about something the wrong way, I feel really bad.
But is that not the risk you take? Firstly, if you go to university, and secondly, if you read.
Oh God.
And you don't want everybody kind of feeling nothing when they read your work.
Absolutely. I do think that an awful lot of young people should be told, you know, that you have to toughen up. Life's tough. It really is hard. You know, if you're going to live a full life, as hopefully you will, awful things are going to happen to you.
Yeah, and maybe in a way, like they say that people who read an awful lot, that it helps them psychologically, that's a thing for people who read a lot of fiction, because you enter into other people's worlds other than your own, and sometimes that can be helpful maybe in navigating your own travails. Absolutely.
And you know, terrifyingly, I think I am coming across an awful lot of people who don't seem to read with an open mind. They seem to read in a very narrow way. They seem to kind of funnel their expectation, and they funnel what they read through their expectations, if you know what I mean. And anything that kind of falls outside of what they expect to happen in the story upsets them, and you know, and to them might seem offensive somehow. And I think that's silly. You know, I think you have to open your mind and heart to read, because reading has to be an act of generosity. I think, you know, I think that you have to accept that what's written is written, basically, and you know, unless it's some kind of mad tract, you know, that's intended to harm. You know, all fiction, I think, and all creativity and all art comes from a place of love and wonder, and I think should be received kind of in the same way.
Well, that's actually handy enough, because the next question I want to ask you is about cultural appropriation, or it's sometimes called subject appropriation. I'm just going to read out a short definition of what that is. Cultural appropriation, or subject appropriation, is defined as occurring when a writer depicts a culture or community other than his or her own, or by writing in the voice of a specific member of that community. Now, Margaret Drabble once said, on the other hand, that appropriation is what novelists do. Whatever we write is knowingly or unknowingly a borrowing, nothing comes from nowhere. Now, you've written over the years from the perspective of a Syrian refugee, a traveller youth, and an Eastern European labourer. What do you think about the idea?
Congolese immigrant.
Okay. What do you think, and many women, what do you think about the idea that writers shouldn't write from the perspective, say, of a race, sexuality, gender identity, nationality, or sex that is not their own?
Just ridiculous. I mean, is that the definition, really?
Well, I mean, it's...
What was that?
What?
There'd be nothing to write about.
Exactly, yeah. That's the thing. I mean, as I was saying earlier, Sarah, if I stayed in my lane, and that's a phrase that you hear a lot, that people just stay in their lane. Actually, just before I start my answer, you know the way I say that I read all the reviews that go up on Goodreads, and I've kind of weaned myself out that a little bit, so it's not, I don't do as much anymore, but I did see an awful lot of people getting really angry in Goodreads about me writing in a female voice in All We Shall Know, my novel All We Shall Know. And I was surprised how upset they were about that, but no one got upset really about any other appropriated voices that I had in my novels or stories.
You've been very lucky.
Oh, I've been very lucky,
because,
yeah.
I mean, another person, we're not going to mention any names because we must watch our step here because we don't want to get cancelled given that this is being recorded, so we won't mention any names. But let's just say there are other Irish writers out there who got a hard time.
Yeah, absolutely.
We know who we're referring to, I imagine. So we'll move on quickly from that, Donal, for both our
Sure.
sakes, because I could say a lot on that subject, but I won't. So there's a lot of people in Queen of Dirt Island who want to be writers, and Josh, one of the characters who you said is a bit like yourself, which I'm a bit surprised. I don't know you that well, but
I think Josh is fundamentally a very decent boy, you know. So
at times we can do with a good kick.
Shit, yeah.
Anyway, I don't know, to be discussed. Fundamentally, he is decent, yeah. So Josh in Queen of Dirt Island says that it's the duty of the novelist to make a record. He also says things a lot more pretentious than that. Seamus Heaney has once said that a writer's duty is to turn up at the desk. What do you think is the duty of the writer, or role of the writer, if any, in society?
Well, I remember talking awful shite in my 20s about being a writer, to girls mostly, trying to impress them, and stuff. Very like the things that Josh says to Saoirse in the novel. But you know, I genuinely believe that if you set yourself the task of writing, first of all, you're obligated to make, and you want to be read, you've got a very obvious and immediate obligation to make what you write readable. And I think that sometimes writers forget that, and I do occasionally come across writers who see themselves as conduits for all sorts of energies in the universe, and just as, you know, as kind of as receptacles for beauty, basically, and they see it as their job to filter all this beauty into the eyes of the witnessers of their art, and they refuse to compromise in any way. And so if that means that they have to write a novel, you know, in a certain way, in a certain voice that's completely, you know, incomprehensible to anybody else, then so be it. But the chances of them getting that published are almost nil. I think that we have an obligation to be clear, and we have an obligation to try our best to try to arrive at some vicinity of truth. You'll never arrive at truth. You know, we're never going to perfectly encapsulate what it is to exist in any kind of work of art, because if that happens, we're going to hang our hats.
If you've that cracked, like you've got a lot of things solved.
Exactly,
yeah.
And then art will no longer serve a function. You know, the truth will have been arrived at. It'll be represented in this perfect piece of art, and then all other art will become ancillary and redundant, and still beautiful, of course. And in a way, it is. Like, in fairness, no one needs me to write books. No one needs me to write short stories. No one needs me to be a writer. If I went off in the morning, as I often tried to do, and started to drive articulated lorries, which I'm qualified to do, and I'm very good at, nobody would miss me. You know, they'd say, "Oh, Donal Ryan, hey,
come now, really?"
Oh no, someone might go, "Jeez, you meant Donal Ryan disappeared after this. He hasn't brought a book out in ages. He's book a year there for a good while." Maybe, you know, no one really care.
I'm just wondering, this is still working. I really don't like these microphones. This is sort of looping back to kind of what we were talking about at the start. I've read that you said that at the start of your career that you've spoken about a sense of shame at the outset of your career about the idea of being a writer. What was that about? Why did you feel that? Why shame?
I just seemed embarrassing, to be honest. My friends were all, you know, blocklayers and engineers, and you know, they all had kind of stereotypically, you know, male jobs, really. And they could all do stuff. They could all, you know, I can do stuff with cars and stuff like that, but, you know, I'm very bad at my hands in general. And so this, I knew, was the only thing in the world I was good at. And it was kind of embarrassing that I was bad at sport. I was bad at every practical thing that a human can do. And the only thing I really excelled at was putting words together. And this, to me, you know, it seemed shameful. coming from the milieu I come from. But there was no reason for my shame or my fear, because I always had good friends, really supportive friends. I had a gang of lads in school, and I just stood in the middle of them. They were cool and tough. I wasn't, but they just, I was cocooned by them. And I always had friends like that who encouraged me and were generous about my proclivities. But it was just a kind of just an internal thing. It was just something I couldn't shake for ages. It seemed, I still kind of feel a tiny frizz on it. A few weeks ago I was in a jacuzzi in a gym in Limerick. Enjoyed my jacuzzi, and a fella got in. And the way you're in a jacuzzi on your own, because you go. Anyway, he started talking. Turned out he was a very interesting guy, and he was a DJ. And so he told me all about his life as a DJ. And he said, "What do you do yourself?" And for a minute, I was going to lie and say, I'd say something else. That not. I was going to say I'm a civil servant, as I used to be for years. And I thought to myself, why am I embarrassed? And even when I said the words, I'm a writer, I could still feel that strange embarrassment,
Yeah, no, I get that, but given that you've won so much and done so well, it's probably lessening as time goes on. But yeah, you could hardly be accused of having imposter syndrome. So, just as I mentioned earlier, like at festivals, I just know myself from going to a lot of festivals over the years. I said lots of writers, published and unpublished writers. What's the best bit of writing advice that you were ever given by another writer, if any?
Well, Colin McCann, I met him very early on. The first festival I ever went to actually was the Kate O'Brien Festival in Limerick, and I met Colin McCann, and I was a little bit awestruck and starstruck. He was really nice, and he said, never, ever say anything negative about anybody's work, ever. And it's just such great advice. He said also, he goes, all you have to do to be a writer is write. And I knew this. It's the most basic, it's tautology basically. The minute you start to write, you're engaged in the act of writing, and therefore you are a writer. But I'm always amazed by the amount of people who actually will say they're writers, and they will have Twitter handles described as a writer. They'll say they're scribes, writers, wordsmiths, word wranglers, but they don't write at all. And I don't know what. Oh yeah, people.
That sounds a little bit sexual. Word wrangler. I don't know. There's something odd about that.
It's a nice one actually. Word wrangler. Yeah. But I mean, but the basic thing is that once you start to commit yourself to the act of writing, once you've written one word, that's it. You started. You're underway. Just keep doing it, and all you need to do is read and write. And there are loads of things you can do in order to maximise your potential, in order to make sure that what you're writing, is crafted properly. But the main thing you have to do is write.
Do you think that there's something fundamentally egocentric about being a writer in imagining that one has something to say to impart to others?
God, yeah, absolutely. And I struggle with this because my ego.
Do you though?
Oh no, genuinely.
You don't really seem like someone who's struggling with me.
Sarah, you're the best of me, really. But my ego is deflated most days, and it has to be pumped up by external forces. My wife usually, she has a metaphorical foot pump that she uses every day to get me going. But I do think that there is something inherently narcissistic about it and self-serving in the act of writing. And because you do assume in this transaction between you and the story, you are a godlike figure. You are all powerful. You are necessarily omnipotent. People say, "Oh, the story wrote itself," and I know I said something like that about the Lord Island, but really, you are creating this thing from nothing. But then, a few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to have my portrait painted at the Faoláin Arts Festival in Galway, and the guy, it was for an event where this guy painted me on the stage. It was unbelievable. I can't think of his name. He's a really good, famous artist actually. But he said, what this is? This is one part of the universe, me, looking at another part of the universe, you, and then trying to make a picture of what that part of the universe looks like. And it was such an amazing thing to say, and he's so right. Like we are all part of the same fabric. We're all composed of the same particles. We're all the same thing, really. And so, when I tell a story, it's a part of the universe telling another part of the universe something that didn't happen. It's
or maybe it did happen, given that you go around taking everything down.
Oh yeah, sure, appropriate everywhere, yeah.
Be honest now. Just when someone is telling you something, right? In your life, like maybe confessing something personal. The way Graham Greene said that there's a sliver of ice in every writer's heart, or broadly speaking, something like that. Are you half thinking, listening and being sympathetic, but half thinking this would make good material?
No, I honestly have never ever had that thought. I've never thought to myself, oh, that's going to be a good story. Seriously, never ever.
You've never had that thought?
No. Might flirt afterwards.
Mahu. I just wanted to ask you as well, I could be completely way off base here, but I kind of get this kind of bang off your work sometimes that there's, especially the latest book, that there's something almost slightly spiritual about it. I just couldn't put my finger on it when I was reading it. Do you have a faith? I know it's quite a personal question, but...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up like nearly everybody else that I know in a traditional Catholic household, and we said a rosary when I was a kid at home, and my parents were always very careful about Mass and confession and all of the sacraments, and always very observant. But when I looked at it closely, when I was a bit older, looking back at my grandparents' faith and how they practiced their faith, it was almost pagan. There's such a close connection to the earth, and they read signs so intensely, and they saw omens everywhere, and they measured the landscape all the time for what the day was going to be like, and what they could do that day, and they were so connected to the soil and to the earth that it was a kind of pagan thing, and Our Lady was just, I mean, for them she was just this all-encompassing mother figure, but she was Aphrodite, and she was all of the female gods, she was fertility, and she was bounty, and she was good fortune and good luck, and you looked to her all the time for your luck, and kind of blamed for everything went wrong. I'll never forget my grandmother, God rest her. I mean, she's part of my soul. But in her last days, she turned against Our Lady. It was so shocking, and she was in a hospital with a statue of the Virgin Mary up on a high windowsill in her bed, and she said, "Donal, climb up there and turn her away from me. Turn her away from me, because that's what she's done. She's turned her back on me, because she was in such pain, and things had gone so wrong for her." And it was so strange, because she'd lost children in her life, and she'd had such a hard life and always kept her faith. But still, it was still between her and the Virgin Mary in her soul,
Well, your answer kind of makes sense to me, because I did get that from your work, and frankly, as a reader, I found it very refreshing that when you're dealing with priests and things, you don't fall, what is in my view, certainly at least, into the trope of having, the paedophile priest. Obviously, there were lots of priests, sadly, that were paedophiles, as we know. But not all priests are paedophiles, and sometimes it's quite tedious when you're reading to have every priest character to be abusing children. So that was one way that I got a hint, but it was more sort of a general sense. And actually, just one last thing, and then we'll let people go. I was actually kind of indignant on your behalf when I read this. It's kind of tangentially allied, sort of, to what we were just talking about. So early on in Donal's career, a woman at a festival accused him of paddywhackery in his writing. She said to him this, right? "You are a disgrace to literature and to Ireland for making the English laugh at us." And I just, when I kind of read that, half me laughed, and the other half me thought, right, there's always going to be a nutter, the one nutter at the very least at a festival, if not more, high nutter quotients sometimes. But you've actually studiously avoided a lot of the cliches. Where do you think that attitude comes from?
It came from bad language, basically. She was really, really outraged and horrified by bad language this lady. And I made the point that apparently Hermann Göring was also horrified by bad language, and loads of the Nazi Party. And I'm sure loads of the people who watched people being marched to their deaths were horrified by bad language as well. And she took this very badly. And she stood up. She must have been 100 years old now, so I'm not being disrespectful. She was a very elegant and fine lady, but she stood up and she was wearing the shortest skirt I've ever seen with a human.
Did you say she was?
She must be showing 100.
100?
Yeah, she was
I didn't know she was 100
she
when I was so angry on your behalf.
And she had a really long finger, and her fingers, she had crooked with paddywhackery. That's what you do, paddywhackery. And then she went on about filth and profanity and how my parents must be ashamed. I was really hurt, and I actually appealed to the organisers of the festival. Are you going to intervene here? Is anybody going to intervene here? Because actually, I just read a short story to the audience, and I got this standing ovation, and they all loved it. I said, you all loved me a minute ago, and now you're letting this lady berate me, and no one's going to step in here, no? Okay, fine. And I actually went off sulking, I went home sulking. And I was glad I brought my dad's new car to that festival so I could swan out of there and dad would see it. Poor man, it's the only good car he ever had in his life. But it came in handy at that moment.
Anyway, on that note, we've gone 5 minutes past the hour, so I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'd particularly like to thank Donal Ryan.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks so much.